Yay. All right. Welcome, everybody. This is Will Eisner Week, brought to us by the Will Eisner Family Foundation, Carl Gropper and Nancy. And this is a series of events that are happening around the world. And so we have a fantastic group of panelists right here from all over the country. And so we're going to talk about Will Eisner. We're going to talk about comic books. We're going to talk about authors and stores and education and all kinds of cool stuff. And I am very much looking forward to learning a lot myself. So if we have time at the end, we'll do a little bit of Q&A. I know there's some people on the Facebook page and there's somebody here. There's a few folks here in the Zoom meeting as well. So again, I wanted to say thank you to Carl and Nancy Gropper for kind of putting all this together for all of us and continuing the legacy of Will Eisner. So what we'll do is we'll just kind of go through introductions, a little bit about ourselves first, and then we'll hop right into talking about Will Eisner and his legacy, and then we'll see where that conversation goes from there. So my name is Tim Smythe. I always forget to say my name. I am a high school social studies teacher for, let's see, I started the day after 9/11. That was fun. And I have a master's degree as a reading specialist, and I am the author of Teaching with Comics and Graphic Novels, which I'm happy to say was nominated for an Eisner Award last year. So thank you for all that. And I run teachingwithcomics.com, and I really go around the country and I do professional development with libraries, universities, education conferences, things like that, really about comics as literature. And before I forget, on my website, teachingwithcomics.com, at the very top, the first link is a lot of the sources that the panelists shared with me. There are lots of different things on there for you to use in your libraries, in your schools, as parents, and things like that. So on teachingwithcomics.com, right there at the tippy top, you'll find lots of helpful links that you'll be able to use really tomorrow, if you so choose. So we'll just kind of stick to, it just kind of goes a little bit better, I think, just kind of have a flow. So we'll start with Sara, then Christina, then Shannon, then Moni, and then Jana. So if Sara, you introduce yourself.
Sure. So I'm Sara Smith. I'm the district librarian of a school district in Central California. So we have about 20 schools that are K-12. And before that, I was a high school teacher librarian for 9 years. So the background is actually the comics section that I helped curate for 9 years at the high school there. And so now part of my job is to help curate for all of the different libraries that I oversee. So that's been a fun challenge and a transition for me is to help get like elementary and middle school comics because I've been mostly focused on 9 through 12. I also run the graphiclibrary.org, where I do reviews for librarians and for teachers and parents. I've actually had a couple students reach out to me to try and get reviews for books that they were interested in. But this is where I read just like I read whatever I want to basically, and I put reviews out for other people. So it's a two-paragraph review format where I do one review or one paragraph is summary, and then the next paragraph is what I think about how it would work in a library or in an educational setting. And so it's just trying to help get a lot of manga mostly, but a lot of comics for collections for other people. And I also review for Booklist and for School Library Journal. So trying to get more manga in the hands of people through professional reviews as well, because that's a area that's sorely lacking to try and do collection development as well.
Thank you, Christina.
Thank you. I'm Christina Taylor. I am the library management consultant for the state of Texas. My background is actually in youth services. So I became a consultant in the past 3 years. Prior to that, I spent over 2 decades in K-12 public education, 15 years as a classroom English teacher and 7 years as a school librarian. Um, I guess that's kind of me in a nutshell. I dabble in a lot of different areas. Obviously, I'm a comics librarian as well. I'm very active in my community in various ways. I like, community volunteerism, organizational management. I have a lot of passions, so I'm not going to go into each one at this point, or we'll never get on to talking about anything else. So that being said, I'm going to pass the mic over to Shannon.
Awesome. So I'm Shannon Live. I am the co-founder and president of Bat City Comic Professionals, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization and an Eisner finalist comic book store that is located in Bradenton, Florida. We are all about creating resources and opportunities to help with reading, writing, and imagination skills through comics education. So we've got partnerships with 4 counties worth of libraries. We've got partnerships with the school system in our area. We've got partnerships with the Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts of America, as well as the Boys and Girls Club. And we develop reading programs and writing programs for them, all generated through comic books, so that kids can find a passion for it, as well as learning all those skills that they need to not only pass their test but understand concepts. And so I started as a reading and writing specialist in schools and developed my program in my classroom through comic books and pop culture material. And that's kind of how this all spurred out from there for me, working with Title I students and finding that passion. And last year in September of 2023, I actually gave a TED Talk or TEDx program on how to use comics to help kids find their voice through comic book writing. So that's basically the short version.
I think it's me next. You have some of the most like well-rounded and accomplished human beings here. And so it's going to take us all day just to do these awesome introductions. I'm Moni Barrette. I was a public librarian for 16 years, during which time I started a comic book collection that kind of led to talking at Comic-Con and Comic-Con book clubs. I last year was an Eisner judge and also was the president of, of the Graphic Novel and Comics Roundtable of the American Library Association. So I'm still involved with that as well. It's been 5 consecutive years of served sentence on that, but it's been a lot of fun. I also work in San Diego on the SCSU Comic Studies grant. I work with that group, lecture there from time to time. What else? Oh, I am the co-founder of Creators Assemble, where we utilize gaming and popular culture, primarily comics, in classrooms and library spaces. We're right now coming up with a toolkit for with learning outcomes for using games in libraries and schools. So we're going to be rolling that out all summer. And I think, oh, and I am the publisher relations person and in-house librarian for Comics Plus, which is a digital comics service where I talk the indie publishers into working with us so that we can distribute their books to comics and to libraries and schools.
Bringing up the back of the alphabet. My name is Jana Tropper. I'm a speech and language pathologist in the Midwest. I work with preschool through 5th grade students, mostly in a self-contained program, but gen ed as well. I also run a 5th grade comic book club. In addition to that, I write comics on Epic, Seeker Society, and also Animal Rescue Friends, which is in print. I also am the director of literacy for Reading with Pictures, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to getting comics into schools and schools into comics. And I have 3 dogs and play video games. Thanks for having me, Tim.
Yeah, I was just turning my head. I know I have it here, but the Reading with Pictures book, I have, I don't know, probably 10 copies somewhere, but it's one of the ones that I highly recommend for people when they want to get started. There's math stories and all onomatopoeia, language art stories. I'll find it at some point, but with the Reading with Pictures. So awesome. So
Okay,
yeah.
so funny story, really quick. Sorry.
Yeah, no.
Animal Rescue Friends was one of the books that I reviewed for School Library Journal. So that's funny.
I hope it was a good review. I don't know that I've seen it.
It was, yes.
Oh, good. Hooray.
That could have been awkward.
I know.
You know, and I've learned a lot from Sarah's recommendations too. I am not well versed in anime and manga, but some of the recommendations she's had, and then that allows me to then open those conversations with my students, who then have a lot of recommendations too. And so I'm getting a little bit better with all that, because you walk in the Barnes and Nobles and that is the giant section, and I'm like, okay, time to get involved. So I appreciate all the work that you all are doing. So I thought we would talk a little bit about Will Eisner. You don't have to be an expert on Will Eisner, but if you wanted to speak a little bit to his legacy and impact. And so I thought I would kind of just share what we're using in my classroom this week. So the plot is from Will Eisner, and it's a graphic novel adaptation of The Secret Story of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So this is the story, the idea that there was a super secret plan by Jewish elders, that are attempting to take over the world, and they come up with this plan, and so they're smart enough to do that. But of course, they're dumb enough to leave it laying out for someone to find. And so this is a document, unfortunately, that continues to be used by white supremacy groups, anti-Semitic groups, to point to there's this historic evidence of what the Jewish people have been trying to do to the world. And I'm just going to read a couple of words from what Will Eisner himself says in this adaptation. And he says, I grew up during the Great Depression, experienced prejudice, painful incidents, and indignities that often befell Jews in our society at that time. I remember being angry at the attitude of my parents who advised that we should be quiet and not offend the Goyim. To them, the Holocaust was another, only much bigger pogrom. As a student in the late 1930s, I became interested in the devices that anti-Semites used to promote this message. And so he came across the protocols, and he turned it into a graphic novel, and then he goes on to say why. Over the years, hundreds of books and competent scholarly articles have exposed the infamy of the protocols. These studies, however, are written mostly by academics and are designed to be read by scholars or by persons already convinced of their fraudulence. I spent my career in the application of sequential art as a form of narrative language. With the widespread acceptance of the graphic narrative as a vehicle of popular literature, there is now an opportunity to deal head-on with this propaganda in a more accessible language. And I think those words speak very much to the power of the comics medium and why we do these things that we're doing. And I've used this book in my classroom for probably about 15 years now. And it really has a powerful impact on the students. And then we just started talking about AI and the idea that AI can pull from a document like this, not knowing that although it is a historical document, the obvious bias and inaccuracies and all those types of things that are built in. And so it really opens up those really powerful conversations. And again, on part of the resources that we're sharing from today on my website, to say it one last time, teachingwithcomics.com, at the very top, there's a Google Doc from today. It says Will Eisner Celebration. And the Will Eisner Foundation and the Anti-Defamation League were kind enough to send me a link where a lot of this book is available with teacher plans. And I'd be happy to add my own teacher plans to that, but I think it's a really well done what they did. So you could literally use this book in your classroom starting Monday if you're listening to us. And so, well, again, we'll just kind of start off again with Sara, kind of about Will Eisner, the impact, and then we'll just kind of pass the mic from there.
So I think for me, like the power is just the sequential storytelling. Like he was one of the first to put like pictures with words and have the power with art and show, how sorry, I'm like I'm great to go first on this question. But just to have the power of words and art together, um, and have that impact with the visual medium, and then to see it grow from like we had the spirit in Sanger High, and it hardly like ever moved because it had just a basic buckram cover. So it had nothing on the outside. But then when you opened it up, it was just kind of a magical moment for kids to see just these kind of old style drawings. And then to see from the art illustration style to now what we have. And it, for me, it was always kind of magical to think about the evolution of art and style and like what we have today. And I'm a big manga person, so seeing how comics got exported to Japan and now imported to America, and some of that came from Will Eisner originally. And like how does that medium come to another country and then back to its country of origin and its impact on students? That to me was always fascinating.
Okay, I was going to say, Christina?
Thank you. So I have 2 points about the impact of Will Eisner in graphic narrative. Is that first, looking at the historical impact, just the fact that he moved the narrative form beyond just superhero serials, which were often perceived as being quite juvenile, to longer form narratives, what really set us on the path of what we think of as literary graphic novels, which tends to be my happy place when I'm reading. But to these longer form narratives that we think of as being more mature, and or that are often believed to be more mature, perceived to be more mature, and focusing on everyday people that sometimes they are experiencing extraordinary circumstances, but many times they're just living their life. And so as a, again, reader of literary graphic novels and a fan of I just went blank on what on the word is that I want. I was going to say, as a fan of realistic fiction, that very much speaks to me. But that's the historical impact. I also like the living legacy, the fact that the Eisner Foundation currently has, and this is near and dear to my heart as a librarian, currently has grants that are offered to libraries that help them develop their collections, their comics and graphic novel collections, but also grants that help them develop innovation to offer those comics and graphic novel services to their communities. And as a library management consultant that works throughout, sorry about that, I muted myself. As a library management consultant that works throughout the state of Texas, that I am working with library directors and managers on how to better serve their specific communities, I love that the Living Legacy offers funding to help them do that, to better reach all members of their community. So that's the importance to me. Passing off to Shannon.
For me, kind of in the same way as Christina, one of the things that as a store owner that I love is that idea of having more than just the superhero genre. I also am married to a man who is an obsessive Dick Tracy collector and lover. And so the pulp hero and that idea of these guys who didn't need superpowers to be incredible champions of good in the world was such a great legacy for the spirit in general. And just to have that and to be able to point people towards that is a big thing for us. We're constantly trying to reiterate the message that comics are not just superheroes in our store and in our work that we do. And so to have these street level heroes of their own brand is such a great thing to be able to turn back to, and to have those slice of life stories like Christina was referencing with that realistic fiction even is so fantastic. The other thing is, in the sense of the living legacy, the Eisner Award for the best comic book store in the world is actually called the Spirit of Comics. And so it is literally built around this exact thing. Can you exemplify knowing about comics and talking about comics and spreading the word of comics, but also what good are you doing in the world? How are you helping make the world a better place? And if that doesn't just speak to Will Eisner's legacy in of itself, that you have to be about promoting comics and about creating comics conversation and about doing good in your world, like that is the perfect example of it. And, we love to be able to talk about that in as many ways as we can. Go ahead, Moni.
How do I even follow? So as Christina mentioned, the continuing legacy, the Eisner grants for libraries, aforementioned the 5 year service in GNCRT, one of the biggest bright spots of many great highlights was getting to, speak at the ceremony where we basically awarded the libraries, because the projects that these libraries are doing across the country that end up winning the innovation or the, I just blanked on the other grant, but that end up winning these grants are just, you would never hear about them, or I would never hear about them if it weren't for, them getting up on stage and being so excited to have won, a small collection of graphic novels and to be able to keep supporting whatever amazing things they're doing in their community. And then the Eisner Awards, as mentioned, but I would be remiss in not mentioning that, because obviously, like, there's other awards in our space, but it's so great to see the recognition, and it's so great as a former judge to have come together, made friends for a lifetime, gotten to go, everybody can go to the party at Comic-Con, and it's amazing. And it's just a real bright spot and a real positive force in our space. And that's just part of the Eisner legacy.
So my connection with Will Eisner is a little more personal. My father is Jewish, but he had a pretty complicated childhood, so it's not something he talks about much. And it's not a faith I was raised in. But centuries from now, my bones will say I was Jewish. It's an ethno-religion, so it is part of my very genetics. And so being able to access parts of that in a way that may not be personal to my specific line, but in a broader sense, my people, has been a gift, especially when it's wrapped in my favorite medium.
Yeah, and that the anti-Semitism goes throughout several of the stories from Will Eisner, both nonfiction and fiction. This is the only nonfiction, but there's certainly several other stories as well, and I think that speaks very powerfully to all those. So yeah, I guess if we could kind of talk, I know it's always a cheesy question, and it's but in terms of like how we got into comics, because I think for parents and teachers and librarians, and we want them to see those kids in front of them, and I think a lot of us have a really powerful origin story. And so for me, and I'll try to be brief, I have two. One is personal, and one is about my son that I always say. But for me, growing up, I had I had kind of a rough childhood. I'm surviving through some abuse and other things. And it was these stories, and I've heard this from so many nerds, that these stories kind of like literally saved them. And it did the same for me. And for me, particularly, it was the X-Men. And so you have these kids who also had a rough background, and from families in some cases that literally kicked them out, and they found a new family with Charles Xavier and the school. And for me, and I say this to my students all the time, like a lot of cases, family is more than biological. A lot of times it's those who you choose. And these kids who had every reason to be angry and give up on society, they chose to come together and make the world a better place. And we see that with just about any superhero who has an awful backstory, murders and death and all these things, and they didn't give up, and they kept going. And that was always a force of motivation for me. And it's also the reason why I became a teacher, because I wanted to be that adult that I needed when I was a kid. I mean, I went to school at Philadelphia Public Schools, had a great education, but my two loves were hip hop and comic books. And I could talk about Public Enemy and Chuck D and Be Dope and all that stuff, but I never mentioned that I liked comic books because I probably would have gotten beat up at that time. And now my own children and my students are proud nerds. Like it has completely changed where we are. And so that ties into my son, who has a really rare form of meningitis, and he has severe nerve pain, migraines. He's in 10th grade now. And when he was in kindergarten, so this is a kid who has every single reason to not want to go to school. There were days where he could just sit there, and that's all he could do, and he would listen. And in kindergarten, of all things, his teacher termed him a reluctant reader. And it's the only time I'm not a violent person. I almost went across the table at this educator, and he he gave up on school. Like I saw him give up on school, and anything that were comics related or superhero related, anything like that, she looked very much down upon. They were not allowed in her classroom because they interfered with her process. And it's actually the motivating factor of why I went back to school to be a reading specialist. And I was the only non-elementary school teacher in the whole program. They didn't know what to do with me. And that my professors were very open-minded. And so I wound up writing my thesis of using comics and pop culture to create engaged, analytical, empathetic readers and writers. And so I'm very thankful for that. And now my son is in 10th grade. He's at tech school. He's going for graphic design. I always try not to cry when I talk about him. He's my own superhero. And it's the first time I really see him so excited for school. Like nothing against the history teachers like me or English teachers, or this is his thing, and this is what he wants to do. And he knows this in 10th grade. And he loves to read, and he reads everything. His room is full of books. And it was because comic books allowed him to fall in love with reading. It was that passion, it was that interest, it was all those things. And so I'm very proud of him and my girls too, who also learned really to read and write through comics. So I don't know how brief that was. So I'll shut up now if maybe Sara could get me off the hot seat and kind of talk about yours as
Um, well, okay, so my comics origin story. I always say that my gateway drug was Sailor Moon. And so my friend gave me Sailor Moon when I was in seventh grade. And I also kind of had a bit of a struggle with reading. I was a voracious reader, but I had a problem where with chapter books where I would pull a word from the line below and always like pull words into other places. So I had to read with the bookmark constantly. So even like all the way into 10th grade, I was reading with bookmarks because I would pull words. And so I found reading manga and comic books helped me because word balloons helped put the words and I didn't have a problem pulling words in the word balloons into other places. It separated enough of the text and even narration, like if there was enough narrative text where even if it was a big block, I wasn't moving words around and I didn't have to use a bookmark to read comics. So it helped me train my eyes a little better. And I grew out of having to use a bookmark even with my chapter books. So around 11th grade, I stopped having to use that. And I remember like even in 10th grade, kids were making fun of me for having to use a bookmark in English class. And they're like, why are you doing that still? And I'm like, you freaking leave me alone. I'm like, what do you care how I read a book? Um, so yeah, it helped me like train my eyes a bit more. And like I would sit at Barnes and Noble and try and read as much manga before my mom came back and was like, "Okay, you have to make your selections." And like, we need to leave it because you couldn't buy all of them. So you're like, "Okay, well, we got 30 minutes. Like, how many of these chapters can I read before she comes back?" Um, so I definitely fell in love with manga. And comic books was a little bit later for me. I was more into my adult years before I started getting into comics, and it wasn't the superheroes. It was the indie comics that still do it for me. So I have like Image, I have stacks and stacks of Image comics and Boom. Like I can't get enough of anything that Boom publishes. And then I do have my favorite superhero. So I'm wearing my Scarlet Witch. So it's all like magic users. So Doctor Strange and Scarlet Witch, like people that are casting magic in a superhero world. I do like enjoy some of those people, but I can't get enough of some of these like stories that are not necessarily superhero based. So those are my stories.
Thank you, Sara. I was My origin story is a little bit weird. I came to comics later in life, but I will say that I did not come to the comic space later in life. I was privileged and that I grew up in the swaddled in the heart of nerdery. My parents, I did, and I love it, and I still love that. I did realize, though, that not everyone had that. Like when I walked outside of my house, that was not true for everyone. That was not true for all people that had my interests. And my parents were born shortly after World War II. So like my father was born in 46, my mom in 47, or maybe it's 45, 46, I've forgotten now. But they would be approaching 80. And so they grew up right at the time when we're talking about Wortham and the Comics Code Authority. And we're talking about this belief that comics were the corruption of the innocent and completely turning public will against them and building this whole case. So my father, who was a hardcore superhero comics fan, old school DC guy, fully invested in Superman, grew up collecting it, had his most of Golden Age comics Superman, I know, collection, um, tragically lost to him, pretty much quit talking about them. He referred to them as his magazines, but he didn't really talk about them much. All I knew is that he collected magazines in his youth. And I was like, okay, me growing up in the 80s, I'm thinking like Teen Vogue. No, not like Teen Vogue. But so this is who my father was. But I was daddy's girl. I connected with daddy. We bonded over sci-fi. Like I said, growing up in the bosom of nerdery, my brother liked Hulk. And so I was very much in that space, and I had those nerd culture influences. I didn't know where they stemmed from because it was never really talked about on, it was never really where it wasn't vocalized as to where they came from. They were just very much a part of who I was. So fast forward to my late 20s, I married a hardcore comic nerd, and I love him dearly and is my soulmate. But it brought all of these parts of my existence to a talking point level that hadn't been there before. Suddenly, I'm watching my husband, my father in law, my father, and even my brother periodically jumping in with Hulk, talking about comics. And I'm like, these are all things, these are concepts that are not foreign to me. I'm like, why is it nobody was talking to me? They suddenly all started talking to each other. So that's when I realized, I was like, this is very much a part of who I am, even if I've been abstracted from the text itself. So it really felt like coming home. So deciding to develop myself as a comics librarian, deciding to pursue that learning more, dovetailed with my love of literacy and critical thinking and seeing how they could work in that space. And at that point, I had been teaching probably only about 5 years, but I was teaching a core tested area freshman English, which meant I had the dubious honor of teaching the canon with a capital T, capital C, the very thing that very few 14-year-olds have ever chosen to read. And you're pulling teeth, and I'm using this as the fodder for teaching critical thinking skills. And because the curriculum is so jam-packed, there's not a lot of room for innovation. And my communities of practice did not think highly of comics. They weren't suggesting it. It was nowhere in my toolbox. So I missed that opportunity as a classroom teacher. I dabbled with it a little bit, but not anywhere near the way. Like if I went back to teach freshman English now, look out, it'd be a whole different story. Um, but I did get to do more with it as a librarian. And that was one of the things I loved as a school librarian, and I love teaching and I love when classes were brought in, but many times the students in my community, they were walking through my door by choice. They weren't there because they had to get a high school credit because they were going to need to have the skill set to pass the end of course exam. They were there by choice. And so I got to talk to them about, what are your passions? What do you love? What motivates you to read? Okay, you don't consider yourself a reader. How do you like stories told to you? Maybe I can help connect you with something that will turn that around, and you will start looking at yourself as a reader, and you won't think that this is something that you can't tackle. This is not a part of who you are. So I love that, and I loved being able to see how my students light it up, and just how much they were motivated to read comics and things in graphic format. And I also had the privilege of being in a library, coming in after someone who had retired, and the two people who were already in that space, who were amazing parts of the team. And they were the team when I got there. And they had that library program locked down and running, you know, a well-oiled machine. And me as a baby librarian, I'm trying to figure out what I can bring to that equation, how I can be a full curriculum partner and member of that team. The one area that I saw that there wasn't a lot of work being done and no one knew, graphics. And so I was like, that's it. That's my inroad right there. There are pockets of this community, they're not being served, and I can come in and help make those connections. And I'm already drawn to that. And I'm, like I said, in love with nerd culture. And I was like, yes, this is my home. This is where I need to be.
Um, I came to comics in more, I almost feels almost like more of a traditional way. But I actually grew up on Riverdale Street in San Antonio, Texas. And so my mom was really like, you can buy Archie's, but that was kind of the only comics that she ever really gave me as as an option, because they were at the grocery store. So I never actually went to a comic book store as a kid. but I would always get the Archies. And I was very, very confused because I was growing up in inner city San Antonio. And so Riverdale for me looked more like Riverdale, the TV show, than Riverdale, the Archie comics. And so I was very confused about how come my Riverdale and their Riverdale were very different. But as somebody who's obsessed with reading, I would go through an Archie by the time we got home from the grocery store and loved it. I thought it was the greatest thing ever. I just wanted to eat cheeseburgers for the rest of my life with Jughead, which is great because Christina can attest to the fact that I did in fact marry Jughead, who lives to eat cheeseburgers. And so it works out really well. And then I would steal my brother's comics, and if he's watching, sorry if you didn't know that, but I would steal my brother's comics and would go and read them and watch all the cartoons and everything. Growing up in the 80s, we had so many cartoons that were just phenomenal. Of course, we were like the big toy generation where they pushed toys on us all the time, and so just obsessed with all that pop culture. And then I kind of lost it as I got into high school and kind of lost sight of the actual comics, but was still in the pop culture world. And when I got out of college, I ended up becoming a professional cosplayer, which is how I met Christina. And so I actually became a professional cosplayer, worked with a lot of video game companies and Comic Cons, and was just always tabling. And was like, well, if I'm around it all the time and I'm going to make these costumes, I just start buying the books again and seeing what's going on now and not just the stuff that I know from when I was younger. And so I started going back into comic book stores and picking up comics and just fell in love with them. And, to Sarah's point, I found out that indie comics existed, and that changed everything. Like, as much as like Scarlet Witch is also one of my favorite characters in comics and I love superheroes, and I have all those moments where I'm like, I got my Edge of Spider-Verse 2 off the shelf the day it came out, so I had my first appearance of Spider-Gwen and I was so excited that Gwen Stacy finally returned. But getting to find out that every other genre that I loved also existed in comics is really the rabbit hole that dug me back into comics, completely and totally. And then I went to work. My cosplaying actually led me to work at a comic book store. And then it just became, I became Small Press Shan, promoting all of the publishers that were smaller than Image. We know Image, Boom, but everybody that you haven't heard of that comes into those publishers from underneath that. And now I read anywhere from 60 to 100 comics a week and do a live show where I talk about all of them so that all of those indie comics that you might not have heard of. I'm talking about them every week and falling more and more in love with them. And I own my own comic shop, and it all started just because there was a comic book at a grocery store and I wanted to know more about these people who apparently lived not on the same street as me, but I thought I was really close for a long time. Go ahead, Moni.
Yeah, so let's see. I read all of like the Sunday cartoons growing up, right? And my dad had like the original Garfield books and Gary Larson and all those. But I really wasn't exposed to a lot of popular culture in general when I was little. And then as I was getting bigger, I kind of felt like it was just kind of not representative. The women that you see in, 90s superhero comics don't look like most women in the world. And so if I can say that diversity and representation matters, and it certainly it must, right? So, but I kind of resisted like reading more comics as I got older, and I was like, I need serious reading only, but my then boyfriend, so cliche, my husband now, but he was like, no, there really is more to it. And so he got me to read Watchmen. And the fact that Watchmen wasn't an easy read, like I had to reread parts of it and be like, what am I really like understanding everything that's happening here? I was like, wow, there is more to this. It's still superheroes, but there's more to this. And that kind of led to me like learning more, reading more, and then realizing how many other people in the community loved it. Flash forward to I am in my first full-time librarian position, and I really want to make an impact at this new library that I'm working at. And I realize one of the things that's happening is the adults are having to go to the designated teen space to get their comics. And the comics are super mature, and they were like, like Deadpool and like full on, they had mature on the spines, and they're in the teen section. And even before the 2020, post 2020 era of heightened bans and challenges, we librarians and teachers know there've always been complaints over titles. And if the wrong titles are getting into the wrong hands, they should be complaining. And so I was able to point out to our administration at the time that like, they weren't very knowledgeable about comics. And I was like, you guys are going to get in trouble having this stuff, you know? And also it's uncomfortable for the adults to, you know, have to go into the teen section and get their brown bag and go out with their comic. So I was able to do a presentation for them where I had to like talk about, well, here's the designated space and, you know, here's where we can do it. Can I pull them out of the cartoon, you know, the Dewey cartoon section? What can we do? So they gave me a whopping like $200. They let me pull the books out of the cartoon section, have a little tiny space. I made a big sign to make it a big deal. And it did pretty well. And I had adults thanking me for letting them have their own space, asking for volume 2 of the things that we had, which then started the circulation, the checkouts to be big enough to justify having more of a collection. And it just really started to snowball. And then fast forward to like One Book, One San Diego is a community-wide read that we do every year through KPBS. And I heard that a graphic novel was up for a certain one called March was up, and that the powers that be were a little afraid to have like a comic book be the community-wide read because the demographic was a little bit older and that kind of thing. And so I kind of got myself on that committee so that I could help sway the vote for that, and did a lot of really great programming, got to meet Congressman Lewis, just incredible, and saw how like, you know, I was doing a book club at the time, 10 years of the same ladies, mostly older. And they were so mad at me when I was like, we're going to do this graphic novel. And they were like, it's too small to read and it has pictures. And they came back a week later and they were just like begging for volume 2 and they just adored the entire trilogy. So that kind of got me on the radar to start doing talks at Comic-Con, things like that. I saw that Comic-Con had their own book club in libraries and I was like, that's really cool. I want one. So I just reached out and told them I wanted to do it. And I just spiraled. Just long story short, it really brought the community together and showed that you can kind of follow your passion in librarianship. And now I kind of work towards too helping like indie authors and creators see that libraries and schools are another market for them. You know, retail's obviously awesome, being able to sell your book online, digital, everything. But if you want to continue making money and driving discovery, get involved with libraries and schools. So kind of that leads us to where I'm at today. And that's it.
So as I've heard most of you talk about your origin stories, and typically when I hear people in general, like I was looking up what to do as an author to talk about my origin story, when I would do presentations, they typically fell into like one of two camps. One of them was the struggling reader camp, where comics or manga or even, you know, comic strips, political cartoons, whatever, where were this gateway to literacy that had been so intimidating to them when it was a full page of words. So that was like one camp. And that wasn't really me. I was a good reader, like out of the gate, like super annoying about it. Can't do math, still can't do math. But reading, that was my jam, just could do it. That wasn't my origin story. The other one I've heard is something Tim spoke to a little bit, is having difficult childhood in general, varying degrees, where comics were an escape, a relief, whether it was like a very literal alternate universe or just something that they could do that would be a departure from their reality. And you know, while there were some tough things in my childhood, I wouldn't characterize it in that way either. Like my ACEs score is 2 and they're like the boring ones. So I do remember though in high school thinking, you know, as I was like probably the nerd in Christina's class being like, give me the canon. I was the one kid. I was thinking like that comics weren't real reading. And I've come to discover that my origin story is that of the villain. I don't have a hero origin story. I came to it very late. I came to it having just these prejudices in place because it wasn't something I needed. So I didn't seek it out. It wasn't presented to me. I wasn't interested in. I had my literacy needs scratched another way. So it just wasn't a thing I was interested in until college, when I experienced a few intense losses close together and I was in a really rough place, and a friend of mine offered me a comic and it was great. It was so great. The characters were amazing. It was Y the Last Man, and it had all this incredible cast of female characters doing amazing things. Yeah, the lead was a dude, whatever, but that was the least of my worries and interest in that book. It was incredible. And I kept thinking, like, I was so wrong about comics. And if I could be so wrong about comics, maybe I'm wrong about the fact that there's nothing but loss in my life, that I'm not going to come out of this horrible feeling. It was just kind of a reset button, if that makes sense. So I was able to discover comics that way. And I went to all the Comic Cons. I've got zillions. Like, I did find my way to superhero comics eventually and that kind of thing. But I did take a villain's path to get here. And so I hope that my work with students and volunteerism and things like that are part of a redemption arc.
I'm like sitting here forgetting I'm supposed to moderate. Like, this is a panel that I would be like sitting in at a Comic-Con and like listening and taking notes. Um, just the one, like what was said, like this is my home. I think that's what's coming out of all this. And we all have different experiences and different backgrounds. And there's high school students that I have to teach how to read a comic book because they've never read one before. Andrew Iden likes to tell the story, co-author of March, of his English teacher taking comics away from him in class. And then he later went back with the congressman and gave a talk at that same school. And the English teacher came up and talked to him about it. No ill feelings, kind of a thing. And I think that's part of it, is sometimes somebody hasn't like looked in a comic book store in 30 years, and they have certain idea. I mean, not only is there a girl that works at Shannon's store, she owns the store. I mean, that wasn't my experience growing up. It was a very isolated, gatekeeping kind of a place to be. And comic book stores are not like that anymore. It's a whole loving community. And so I think what we'll do, because and I think if we said nothing else, I think that the conversations we just had were really, really powerful. So I think what I'll do is I'll combine kind of the two questions that are the next important ones. It could be, and we've already spoken a little bit about this, but what are your thoughts on comics as literacy or in education? And or we all have different backgrounds and topics that we might want to talk about. What do you see as the importance of comics just in general, whether it be in the workplace, business, school, those sorts of things? And I'll briefly share kind of my own embarrassing, almost villain story as well, where, believe it or not, and I have older students who come back to visit and they come into my classroom and they're like, where was this when we were here? There was a long time that I would, I'm a rule follower, and a lot of it has to do with my childhood, and I try to impress people and all those kinds of things. A lot of lack of self-confidence, and even though I loved comics, I was afraid to bring them into my classroom, and so that wasn't. I separated those two things, and it took Miles Morales, of all things, when Miles Morales came out, that I was a big deal. So I talked about it in class, and I had this young, probably about 16, 17, black kid in my class who was really quiet, just was quiet, good kid. And it was the first time after class he came up and talked to me. And he wanted to know if I could bring those comics in. And he had no idea that Spider-Man was black. And so, all right, so our president's black, right? Obama. And he was honestly more impressed that Spider-Man looked like him than the fact that we had a black president. And I was kind of like, how dare I not, as a social studies teacher, not talk about what's around us, right? And how what's going on in the world is in things. And so when I first started using comics, my certain people at central office were very much against me using them and were not supportive of it. And from ignorance, it wasn't anything mean, it wasn't anything what have you. They didn't understand. And then I got published by PBS, and suddenly like things started to change because my superintendent's like, oh, okay, why don't we get on this? So I got an email from Michael Bendis that hangs up in my classroom. He had read the PBS article about Miles Morales and that story and how much it meant to him, what we were doing in the classroom. And he says, and I was having a really bad day today. And people at Marvel shared your article with me. And so it resonates with what we're doing. And so when I talk with people, I very much try to say, like, I needed permission as a younger teacher to do what I'm doing now. And I wish somebody had given me that permission to do that then. And so I wish I could go back, but I am forever grateful for that. So if, we want to talk about literacy and all those things and all the research and all those things that we can talk about, but it's that connection. It's the Korean kid who walks by and says, there's a Korean Hulk. Wait, what? and captures your attention. It's all those different things that we're seeing. And so I'm just very thankful for all the representation of, I mean, for my own kids, my children growing up, that their heroes are LGBTQ, are Black, are Korean, are Asian, are, and for them now, like if we were to say today, like, oh, Captain America now is, a Black man, they're like, oh, okay. Like there's no shock value. It's not a big deal. Nobody's ruining their childhood, all that kind of gatekeeping that goes on. And I think I very much have a lot of hope that, and that comics will make a change because of that in the next generation when they start to vote. And man, am I encouraging them to vote, when they're 18, 19, 20, because of those reasons. And I don't think we can overlook the impact of all that. So I'll turn it over to you guys. So kind of, I guess, generally with one last kind of pitch here, like what is it that you want to talk about with comics? And I guess we'll just continue with the same order because it seems to be going well that way.
So for me, I think this generation coming up, they're increasingly more visual. All of their social media, like everything is visual. Like TikTok blew up, and everything is all about videos and pictures, and it's less reliant on text. Visual literacy is a very important skill for them, and so teaching more with graphic novels is a hugely important skill that I think if we're not using any graphic novels in our classrooms, I think we're doing a complete disservice to students and just like hamstringing teachers and not using a tool that's just right here. Like it's here. Um, and I actually had an interesting conversation. My brother is in the Air Force and he got a technical manual recently that was entirely like basically comic book format. Like he was flabbergasted that he's looking at a missile guide and it's a comic book basically. It was pictures and it was words. It wasn't like word balloons, like the guy and the instructions was not in a like he didn't have a text box around him, but it was basically a dude and narrative text around him and he was floored. So it wasn't a manual that he was used to seeing where it was all paragraphs, but had a lot of pictures now. And he said basically, I guess the way that we're going with the military is a lot of handbooks that are more comic style. So that's something that's going to be seen, I think, more often because it's easier to understand when you can see something very technical, when you can see it as well as read it. You don't want to accidentally blow something up. Like it's easier to see and understand with something very dangerous like that. He works with missiles. So, let's just use the tools that we have. Let's get graphic novels into classrooms and teach students. There's a wealth of wonderful stories. It's not like we've been talking about. It's not just these trivial like stories that people have in their minds that graphic novels is just junk. And I was thinking about this before we got on, where we're in this weird space as a society where we're banning these books, right? Because they have these pictures that we have admitted to ourselves that are powerful and we need to shield our children from. But in the same breath, we're saying that graphic novels are a trash format. So how can they be both things where they are something that are powerful, but something that are trash? So we as a society need to have a reckoning with graphic novels and come to realize like that they are powerful. And like Moni said, like yes, some have been categorized incorrectly. Um, like in library spaces, a lot of vendors have basically come to like all of them are just adult, like we're just going to label everything as adult and I don't know how to deal with this instead of figuring out where do they need to actually be. Are some of them teens, some of them are kids, some of them actually are adult, and let's figure this out. But they are a powerful tool, they are a powerful medium, and let's start grappling with them and use them appropriately and use them with our students because they can be amazing. That's my soapbox.
For me, comics and what they mean to me and the kind of how they can be used in education goes back to Tim's statement talking about the power of connection. Um, I have been, again, privileged enough that in the course of my journey as a comics librarian, I've had the opportunity to help to co-found the Central Texas Teen and Kids Comic-Con in Texas. And it is a Comic-Con, thank you. It is a Comic-Con that is established in Round Rock Independent School District. It's run by the Department of Library Services. But my former co-librarian, beautiful soul and zany individual, my partner in crime, and I still miss that we don't work together every single day, encouraged me when I was on this path. At one point, I remember she looks at me at the circulation desk and she said, let's host a Comic-Con. And I looked at her and I was like, that's kind of a big endeavor. And she was like, we'll apply for a grant, we'll host, and she's one of those go big or go home people. And so, which scares the life out of me. And I was kind of thinking, okay, let's try, maybe we can scale it down. Yeah, there was no scaling it down. In our first year, I think we had about 5,000 people register for the con. We had probably about 3,500 show up, but it has been growing ever since 2017. I had the privilege of just taking my nephew to his first con. He went to my con, and then told some presenters, oh, by the way, that's my aunt. But yes, it was so sweet. Uh, but I'd taken him to his first con and just being able to see how I can connect with pockets of the community that had not previously seen themselves represented, had not seen themselves represented in nerd space. It was a cringeworthy place for them to be at best, not being able to see people that looked like them, being not only a person of color, but also being a woman that is increasingly shrinking spaces, in a comic space. So that, and if you combine that even more, the fact that I have been enamored of vintage mid-century glamour since I was a wee tiny thing. So all of my cosplays tend to have like a vintage silhouette as well. And so just being able to see people that are suddenly like, whoa, nerdery can look like that. I'm like, oh, it should look like this. It's like, if it can look like this, why can't it look like me? I'm like, why can't it look like you? Who's stopping us? Fly that flag high. And just so being able to connect with pockets of my community, serve my community, serve the larger community, make those connections to the fandom, bringing us out of the shadows. And that is my soapbox as a BIPOC member of the fandom. Growing up in the 80s, we had Urkel hanging over us. And I'm not going to get on that, but I am going to say that it didn't necessarily serve us well for that to be the avatar of what it meant to be a Black nerd. And I feel like we've been living under that pall ever since. And even as it became more and more mainstream acceptable, still adding on to that the additional of already being marginalized in many ways. So it's some craziness, but I'm like, it's time to come out of the shadows. It's time to be, if people aren't ready, they need to get ready. They need to accept that nerdery looks like this. They need to understand that we are not to be otherized. And so just bringing that out, making those connections, having people feel safe, setting up a safe space and letting them know, we're here to support you. It can look many different ways, but we're here, and welcome home. So on that note, I am, as Sarah said, going to get off my soapbox.
As a former guest of that Comic-Con, I will say that it is a fantastic Comic-Con and they make everybody feel so at home and so wonderful in that space. So, and also thank you for letting me be a guest at that Comic-Con. For me, for getting into teaching with comics for me, like I said, I was working as a reading and writing specialist, and I was working at a Title I school, and it was a school for all girls. It had already the Texas strategy is when a school isn't performing well, they turn it into a charter school. When it doesn't work as a charter school, they just close it. And so they had already turned this school into a magnet charter school so that they could make it into an all girls school. And at this point, they were still failing that test, and that's So they were making the students take the test in the fall semester as a practice, and then they would assess where everybody was, and then they would take it again in the spring for the actual test. So these students weren't learning anything except how to pass the standardized test. And there's only so many materials that they could use. So when I got brought in, they asked me to initially just monitor classroom studies. And I just went around and talked to the girls, and I'm like, why is it that you're not paying attention? Why are you not? What is it? What's the breakdown? What do you feel the lost point is? And they said, Miss, I've done the same worksheet 13 times at this point. It doesn't do me any good. I'm not learning anything. I've learned which buttons to press on the task that we're given to make the teacher check me off for the day. And I'm not doing anything. So I'm bored, and I'm going to sit here on my phone, and I'm not going to pay attention. And I said, okay, well, what are you looking at on your phone? And I started having those conversations. What are you interested in? And I went to the school administration and said, look, I'm an outside force. You brought me in from a private education company as a reading specialist and writing specialist. Can I make a suggestion that would get you in less trouble if I do it than if you tried to do it yourself? And they let me start a reading lab that was 6 weeks long and a writing lab that was 6 weeks long. And they were all done off of pop culture. Like, we had a zombie week where we started by looking at images of zombie situations from The Walking Dead. And then we went into reading the script from Beetlejuice. And then we learned figurative language by evaluating whether or not there was actually any kind of monster in Michael Jackson's Thriller. And we kept going, and I had some very upset girls who learned that there were no monsters in that song, and they were very mad at Michael Jackson that day. And I was like, we have more to talk about, but we're going to put that on hold, ladies. And so it was so interesting, because by the end of every week, we would go back to a text that was similar to what they were getting on those worksheets. And by the time they got to the end of the week, they could do it. And when it was just because they were so into what they were doing throughout the week that they were learning, we used Hunger Games at one point, and they were like, Miss, I think that guy's the good guy because I think that kid is cute. And I was like, okay, well, we're going to, again, have more to talk about, ladies, but we need to use this as our platform as in what you're focusing, you're listening. But our writing lab, I sat there and I talked to one of the girls one time, and I said, you didn't answer a single question on your test last time. Why? Why did you not answer a single question on last year's standardized test? And she told me, Miss, the pencil was too far. And there were so many things that they had just gotten to the point where they didn't care anymore. It had been beat into them over and over again that learning was just measuring up to a test score, and a test that they didn't want to take and they didn't want to be a part of. And so giving them the chance to talk about pop culture, they were telling me, I want to be an influencer. I want to be a part of this. And it's like, okay, well, what is it that you like? Let's just talk about what you like. And we're going to work that into next week's lesson. We're going to work that into right now's lesson. We're going to talk about things that you want to talk about, and we're going to put those skills to it. And that's what has been so great about using comic books to teach kids, is because they want to talk about them. They want to be a part of that. I go into a room to teach a workshop to 400 kids, and I start by telling them the story about when I met Dave Pilkey. And then I never have to worry about any of those 400 kids acting up that entire time, because they're like, wow, Miss Shannon knows Dave Pilkey, so she's really cool, and we should be cool because maybe she'll let us meet Dave Pilkey someday. And you just getting them excited about their thing and having that moment where they're able to make that connection. I love when they tell me in the middle of a workshop in our store, I think my teacher taught me this. And I say, she definitely did. And you should tell her that you learned that thing and you applied it somewhere else, because it will make your teacher feel really, really good. And they're like, I am going to tell my teacher, she's going to be so proud of me. And I'm like, yes, just hold on to that moment and remember it on Monday morning so that your teacher can have this victory. And then they have the victory. And the greatest thing, honestly, is giving them that pride in their learning ability and giving them the fact that their interest has value. And I just had a mom the other day who, she left the store and she sent me a message on Facebook, and she said, my son thinks that the greatest thing in the world is when an adult listens to him speak. And most adults don't care about comic books, or they don't care about his art, or they don't care about things. So he gets pushed aside by most adults. And the fact that I might be frozen. Okay, good. I was like, the fact that you stopped and you listened to him and you said, tell me about the book that you're picking up. Tell me why you like that story. And then you let him draw a picture about the thing that he liked. And you told him, like, tell me about your picture. Why did you draw that? What was that character that you drew? She said it changed his mood for the whole day. And having the ability to give kids that empowerment of you can do this, you can learn this thing, you can create this thing. Your imagination can be your skill set that takes you into whatever path you want. Is the greatest thing about using this illustrated medium to talk to kids because they love it, they see themselves in it, and they're able to express that to the world beyond the places that they've ever thought they would be heard before. It's so incredible to do every single day. Go ahead, Moni.
That's amazing. I can listen to you talk about it all day. So yeah, I don't currently have as much opportunity. I do lectures and things, but I'm not in front of classrooms or in the public library setting in a traditional way anymore. But you know, throughout my time working with comics, I've experienced, you know, a lot of the stigma, whether it be you know, ALA colleagues of like comics, sort of like why, you know, we've talked to Library of Congress and that's been like an ongoing push. And then in general, like my own parents, and obviously like now I work at a company where I get to talk to a lot of teachers and librarians across the country. And you know, there's the handful of obstacles to teaching with comics include the bans and challenges, you know, the censorship stuff, the fear, like if doing anything new, right? Like anything that you're not familiar with or that's not in your wheelhouse. And so, especially when you have a job that's as crazy busy as being a teacher or being a librarian is, you know, obviously like comics are like that one little tiny thing of all the things. And so what I've tried to do, basically, long story short, to kind of fill the gap since I'm not actively in front of students that are on a regular basis is try to make case studies, learning outcomes, and really bring education to the folks that provide the education. And that has now extended to even like retailer friends, publisher friends, you know, again, like get your books into libraries why you want to, get your books into classrooms, how are classrooms using them? And so that's been really nice. And I think fills a need out there when you're talking about how to level age appropriate comics, how to talk to stakeholders when they don't believe that, you know, that you should be reading comics at a college level or buying more comics for the library, being able to prove the outcomes for all of these things. So yeah, that's just been really rewarding and I think is kind of my best way of kind of giving back to the field of comics and education, having seen how comics do bring people together, having seen, there's something that we say in GNCRT, which is there is a comic for everyone and comics are for everyone. So, you know, any kind of reader, any kind of interest, there's a comic for you. I don't need to tell you guys that, but for those who might be listening to this. And so you can bring people together that way. And it's important. And, you know, to the teachers out there or the librarians out there, you don't have to like it. You know, it doesn't have to be your favorite thing. There's books that my kids read that aren't my favorite books, but they're reading. And you need to respect and meet people where they are and give them what it is that they want, or they're going to give up on their reading journey. And that's absolutely not what any of us here want. So that's that.
I know we've gone over time, so I'll keep mine brief. Comics to me mean accessibility. It means that our second language learners, third language learners are able to access a story because they've got pictures with it and there's fewer words per page. Our disabled students are able to do the same thing because they've got additional cues to help them understand the story. Our deaf students now have, and hearing impaired students have access to sound effects that help inform the story because the size of it on the page. They have access to visual literacy because, as I think it was Shannon was saying earlier, like their lives are social media. Their lives are all these very visual consumption of media. And that's exactly what comics are, their accessibility.
Really, that was it? A couple of sentences that were like the most powerful couple of sentences that I've heard in a really long time. Like I was like, all right, we're good. Um, Yeah, so God, I the whole time I'm like, like it's like being in church. Like we're all muted, but we're all like I can see everybody. We could go on for hours, and hours and hours. So maybe we should do another one or two or three or four. God help people if we get together in person at some point and do this. It would be fantastic. Um, yeah, so I have all kinds of things that I could say, but I really appreciate everything that you guys kind of shared here. And I think if nothing else, don't be afraid that, like was said, if you are not an expert on comics, that's okay. There's a kid in your class who is, and just ask them. And it probably would be the first time that somebody's ever asked them. So we will share this widely. This will, so again, thank you to Carl and Nancy Gropper from the Eisner Foundation, who put this on every single year to celebrate Will Eisner's birthday, which I think is the 6th, right? It's next week. So we will share widely. Again, if you go to, not to pitch my website, but teachingwithcomics.com, at the very top, there are links that folks shared from the different panels from today that are on there, including, again, a handout from the Anti-Defamation League and the Will Eisner Foundation that will allow you to use this in your classroom, complete with questions and lesson ideas for your classroom. So I thank you very much to everybody. What an amazing experience. Like I said, I was just sitting and taking notes, and so I really appreciate everybody here. So let me stop all the different buttons I got to stop. And thank you so much for everybody. And